Like this white suburban Jewish boy from Minnesota who'd gone to Harvard. It was like a big like clash of like, whoa, like I don't know what to make of you. But there was an attraction there, and she kind of in a way I would say like radicalized my politics. First ceremony, I felt like Jesus was present, and I was like, okay, Rabbi, like, what do you want to tell me? I mean, it was a strange experience.
A bit confusing, or?
It was a bit confusing because I had a lot of like programs, self-inquiry process, relational inquiry process, and it can be quite potent. Like I've had a couple people, one I'm thinking of in particular, who's kind of stuck with me for 6 months since I've been doing the circling, and I've witnessed, like in him, a fairly profound transition.
Welcome to this new episode, and today I am here with Oren. How are you?
I'm good, Luca. Good morning.
Very nice. So Oren is a facilitator of circling, authentic relating, and he does also work around parts work and self-integration.
That's right.
Very good. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, what is your story in life?
I grew up in Minnesota, in the US. I was born to a mother who was Israeli, came to the US when she was around 16, and a dad who had grown up in New York, both Jewish. And I would say the early part of my life was characterized a bit by a feeling of out-of-placeness, partly because we were growing up in a suburb where there were very few Jews. My mom was part Israeli. There was a lot of differences between me and like the local culture, and I always felt like a little different and out of place, and that certainly informed a lot of kind of my feeling through life and some of my trauma. Also, I would say, I'll go right into the heavy stuff because it does inform like where my work eventually led in my personal healing journey. So, my mom was born to parents who had survived the Holocaust, both in concentration camps. So she, of course, they experienced pretty severe trauma in their lives. Also, to the best of my understanding, like that trauma, played out in her childhood. Various kinds of neglect and perhaps abuse. She's not really able to talk about it with me, but that's what I understand. On my dad's side, also, like, the family was quite dysfunctional. I would say there seems to be like a big theme of like anger and just various kinds of emotional disconnection. And so my dad was also kind of traumatized by that. And like, as I was growing up, and they were pretty young parents, like 26 when I was born.
Okay.
He had a lot of rage problems. So there was a lot of kind of dysfunction in my early childhood environment. I started kind of as the golden child. To my parents, they both grew up, and especially my mom, her dad was an academic and brilliant, a genius. And so intellect and mental ability was very highly valued, and I was born with also like a genius level, IQ. So, at first they were like, "I show him off to everyone.
Cool.
Ask him about airplanes and how they work when he's 3 years old, right?" And I could tell you about the ailerons and and like all the mechanics and hydraulics. So I like had this precociousness, and so at first I was like, "Oh, they're so excited to have this brilliant child. They can share with everyone." I imagine my parents are going to listen to this. I'm sure there were other dimensions too, but this piece is important. And then I think at some point, because of the various like emotional challenges in the family, and with my dad and so forth, I had a certain level of I can't completely surrender to their desire for who I am. Right? There's like a bit of we have 4 survival strategies: fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. All of those are active in me to this day, but I had a fair amount of fight, so I was also resisting, and so I became the scapegoat instead, where it was like all the family's problems kind of are my fault in a way. Like I get punished, I get, it's like instead of their ability to kind of see their own dynamics and take responsibility. So I spent, this is a trauma I've been working through in the last year a lot of time kind of being locked in my room, yeah? And so there was quite a lot of a feeling of emotional abandonment that was quite painful and kind of deeply, deeply shaped me. So, yeah. So that was kind of the first chapter broadly, but I kind of kept the academic identity. Like I did very well in school, even though by the end of my high school years, I was starting to like feel the effects of the trauma. I would say it was hard for me to focus, but my intelligence was able to still get me the top grades. I suffered from like some depression already, some obsessive compulsive disorder. And then, so I went to Harvard, and when I was there, I think like my natural inclination was more like towards philosophy, and originally I thought maybe astrophysics. I had some challenges freshman year because of my like difficulty focusing. Second semester I took a little bit of a dive like with a math and a physics course, and then this kind of derailed my astrophysics ambitions. I still had this like strong attachment to like intellect, and had this idea I had to like do math to prove that I was smart and worthy. It was a very like weird kind of like complex or something. But I kept taking math and science courses. I wound up graduating in computer science.
Okay.
And could have been applied math. It was a difference of one course. I would say by the time I graduated, I was already a bit like unsure of like who am I, where am I going. I had taken a cognitive psychology course senior year, and I was like, maybe I need to change directions a bit. I seem to be interested in how the mind works. So I took a job with a professor there for a year. And while there, again, what do I do next? My kind of programming kicked in. It was like, well, you should probably go to grad school. So I started a PhD at Princeton in cognitive psychology. Went there for 2 years, but by this time, like the baggage I was dragging along with me really like started to
feel heavy.
Yeah, I was quite depressed, quite unable to focus. Was struggling to connect with my advisor, and by the end of 2 years, it just kind of like I couldn't go on. I asked them for a leave of absence for psychological reasons. I had kind of tried to explore some other dimensions of myself while there. Like I had gotten into the Shakespeare company and did a bit of acting, which felt like a little more alive. I'd taken a Hebrew course. I even tried to do a painting course. I see some lovely paintings here. And, but I didn't have time to keep that in my schedule. But I was trying to expand a bit. And when I left Princeton, I went back to Boston and decided to try theater. So I took a theater training for several months, did a bit of theater, got into political activism next. I met a Polish anarchist woman.
Wow.
Who was she was young. She had run away from home almost when she was 17, 18 in a way, had, squatted in Utrecht in the Netherlands. She had some exotic experiences. I'm this like, you know, white suburban, I mean, she was white too, but like this white suburban Jewish boy from Minnesota, gone to Harvard. She was like a big like clash of like, whoa, like, I don't know what to make of you. But there was an attraction there, and you know, she kind of just in a way I would say like radicalized my politics. She brought me to Noam Chomsky lectures. Like I, you know, kind of was taking me to the anarchist hangouts, and I will say that like it was also like clearly my developmental trauma. Like we had a very difficult relationship. I mean, I think she had a lot of that too, and it was very painful at the same time. It was very intense. At the time when there was a lot of globalization agenda, like the World Bank, the IMF, the corporate kind of global agenda of like, you know, the new free trade agreements, all of that. And there was a large protest movement at the time. This is the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I got pretty active in that, traveled a bit to go to street protests. And I was also bringing in my theater a little bit. I organized some street theater, things like that. And yeah, you know, fast forward a few years of that, I would say. And there was I think the second Iraq war, did we decide? I'm not sure, first or second, I think it was second. And there was a huge, massive, like international protests against the Iraq war. And in
weapons
the US,
of mass destruction, that one, right?
Yeah. So it happened, it wasn't just in the US, but in the US there were millions of people marching. And I was part of that, and part of, you know, quite serious confrontations with the police where they'd be like trying to back their horses on top of us as we're sitting there. And it was scary, but you know, intense. And I guess what happened was I kind of noticed that there was a lot of like anger and disappointment and rage, and nothing's changing, and everyone not everyone, but many people in the movement are like also like angry and frustrated, and I was like, and nothing's changing. You know, they went ahead with the war, they barely covered us in the media, and this kind of drove me. I'd already started to have some spiritual interest, I would say, in the preceding few years, which started really with Buddhism, Zen, and Chinese like Tai Chi, Qigong, martial arts, Taoism, and yeah, it kind of pushed me more towards spirituality, because I was like, I need to find something in myself, you know, because I can't change apparently the wars and what's happening, so let's start here. Yeah, I had met another woman who had kind of introduced me to this, let's say, new age, feminist, Jewish spirituality. I wound up leaving Boston. It was my first time leaving the big city or suburban life, and went to this small town in New York State. Okay,
so you are at the stage where you had your sort of political adventures, let's call them, and then you decide that maybe it's time for you to look inside yourself, and not just from a mind and neuroscience perspective, but more from a spiritual, mystical experience perspective. Is that right?
That's
so.
Right.
So you say you go to this town in New York State, and what do you do there?
Yeah, so I moved into this Jewish retreat center that was hosting retreats for this kind of renewal Jewish community, neo-Hasidic, neo-mystical. We like the word neo here on kohphangan, right?
Sure.
Neo-tantra.
Everything is new, new age.
New. So, yeah, and you know, I definitely got some good things. I mean, I believe I was introduced to nonviolent communication there.
Okay.
I was introduced to, sort of co-counseling, reevaluation counseling, that kind of peer counseling. So there were many things I kind of touched first in that period. But perhaps one of the most significant in terms of expanding me was that I had stumbled sort of across a ayahuasca church, the Santo Daime,
Which one?
Santo Daime.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, which is a Brazilian eclectic church that kind of formed from the combination of the indigenous Brazilian ayahuasqueros and then the I believe the Yoruban African tradition and Umbanda, I believe it's called. I'm not an expert on this stuff. And then Christianity.
Okay, wow, so interesting again.
Now, Jesus was Jewish, so there's some link there. Yeah. But yes, growing up, Christianity was always something I was like, our family was like, we're not Christian, we're Jewish, So I wind up at this ceremony. I think I mentioned to you earlier, like in my first ceremony, I felt like Jesus was present, and I was like, okay, Rabbi, like, what do you want to tell me? It was a strange experience.
A bit confusing?
Or? Yeah. It was a bit confusing because I had a lot of like programs, like I think many of us probably on the spiritual path, as we go further and encounter numerous traditions, we start to see that they're all pointing towards something.
Sure, there's lots of similarities, right? And an idol or another, I mean, it could be Shiva, could be Jesus. I think the psychological and spiritual value is very similar or the same at the end.
Right, so I wasn't quite there yet. I was still more in the particulars, and so it was like the Christian dimension of it was kind of scary to me. Yeah. But I actually wound up, basically another person at my retreat center noticed, oh, you're a little different, what happened? And I told him about the experience, and he was like, I want to come. Soon we had the whole group of like young people who were living at the retreat center there at the Santo Daime church. Oh, okay. They were like, 10 of us at this sort of Christian syncretic ceremony, and quite interesting. It created quite some currents in our community. But that I would say that I did like 10 or 12, I think, ceremonies, and that kind of shook my reality map, let's say.
So was it useful at the end, this experience?
I would say on the long run, definitely. I felt like, I like to refer to ayahuasca as grandmother, and I felt like she definitely got me really for the first time in touch with my emotional body again, my felt sense. In fact, the first time I cried in probably 15, 20 years maybe, because my ability to cry and grieve had been so shut down by my trauma, like was at one of maybe the first actually of the ceremonies I went to.
Okay.
A guy came up to me at the end, he's like, you look like you could use a hug. I gave him a hug, and I just started weeping on his shoulder.
Wow.
So
lots of release.
Yeah,
and
really opened some things.
One of the things of being a seeker and starting experimenting with the New Age is that it's a really fascinating world with so many facets and many sort of roads you can take. So you now got a taste for the anarchist, and then a taste for the Jewish New Age tradition and the Christian ayahuasca New Age tradition.
Yeah, good.
So I guess it's not stopping there. Is that right?
That's right. I like that reflection. Essentially, I still felt this draw to my roots, I would say, and I wanted to get deeper into Jewish mysticism. And I actually wound up for a short time going to a Chabad yeshiva. Chabad is a form of the Hasidic movement, if you know the people with the payas, the curly things, black clothes. I went and studied there for a while, but there was, I would say, this is probably an interesting little anecdote, like I felt the conflict with my sort of, what would you call it, universalist values.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
There was still a lot of particularism and parochialism within that tradition. So even though they had some very deep mystical concepts, there was a kind of, we're different, and like that always was a bit of a struggle for me. Like I really felt like I didn't want to make all these separations or something like that.
Yes. Particularly if you have more of a holistic view of spirituality, then when they tell you that the truth is this and this only, it's a little strange, right?
Yeah, it was hard. So that it pushed me out. Essentially, I couldn't stay after a certain period of time. Yeah, and then I was really kind of, I would say, more of on this like open seeking for a while.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing I missed mentioning was while I was at the Jewish Retreat Center, I connected to a man. His name was Hawk's brother. Hawk's like the, and he was like part Native American, I think part European, and was a practitioner of the martial arts, Qigong Tai Chi. That's how I found him. But he was also a practitioner of shamanism.
Okay.
And so we had started a kind of shamanic circle during that time. I was there. So that definitely started to inform my path, as I did that for about 2 years with him.
Okay.
But then, I also came in contact with some other New Age materials, like channeled material.
Yeah.
And there were some quite influential ones for me. I would say like the biggest one, probably the Law of One, which is like the raw channelings. Pleiadian channelings, these various kind of very New Agey things. And it sent me on a bit of a quest, and this really launched a period for a few years where I was wandering around the United States. Drove across the country a couple times. I wound up spending some time like on the Hopi reservation, meeting like a Hopi medicine woman, tobacco carrier. Wound up meeting this guy who was working with some channeling, who he had written a book about a guy that he said was the reincarnation of Edgar Cayce, David Wilcock, like whole kind of world, and I was pretty deep into that for a few years, the mix of that, and I would say some indigenous traditions. There was a thing called the 13 grandmothers. I think they're still around. Some of the grandmothers might have changed, but kind of exposing myself to that.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, the amount of experiences that you can have within the New Age or the spiritual world in the United States. I mean, it's because we are blessed here with having many courses, etc. But I mean, nothing can, of course, such a big country, and that's where the New Age started in the 60s. So I suppose.
Yeah, there's great variety there, and it certainly was a place where people from all over the world came, so you can find so many things there.
So interesting. Like America is still the Mecca, in many ways. If you are into pretty much anything you want to learn and explore, there's so much.
I like hearing that reflection, because there's a part of me that's like, I don't want to be in the U.S. anymore. But when I hear from someone who grew up in like Europe, I understand how, like in a European country, there's maybe much less exposure to these multiple currents from world traditions.
Yeah, and
less, right?
Different teachers, they speak different languages. If you go to Germany, Holland, or Finland, you might have local mystics and people. In Italy, you certainly have them. But of course, you need to be more of a local to speak the language, whilst the English is the universal language. But I mean, at what stage did you start exploring abroad? Because I think so far your story is very much American.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So when did you come to Thailand, or what's the link?
Right. So we'd have to fast forward about 10 years, I think. So just a couple key pieces in there. Like there was a point where I kind of I had been almost expecting, because of all my contact with these, other dimensional kind of sources and just, strange things, like just to tell one brief moment, like at one of these grandmother circles. So there's these 13 grandmothers from around the world, and then there's hundreds of people who came, American mostly, to be with them. And this woman, I believe she was from Nepal, invokes a circle, and suddenly all around the circle, people start falling to the ground, weeping.
All at the same time?
Pretty much, yeah. They're dropping, as if it was a medicine ceremony.
Wow.
And I'm like, what? And I'm like, I had brought the Hopi tobacco woman, and I was like, what's happening? And she said, yeah, I don't know. But she didn't really tell me. But yeah, it was like, these experiences were quite
interesting, for sure.
Shocking almost. It's like because I had been to medicine work, but to see something in the field she was carrying or evoking that could cause people's systems to react to. So I experienced a number of mysterious things is the point, and I was kind of expecting that I was going to receive some sort of revelation.
Some grace,
about grace. This is your path, this is what you're here to do, like really clear. That wasn't the way it really went for me.
It's not your karma so far.
Yeah, and I wound up kind of washing up on the shores of California, not like really knowing, like I don't understand what, and I started a little chocolate company and basically lived in California for 7 years doing
Chocolate,
that.
yeah, okay. That's a bit of a pivot as well.
Yeah. So during that time, I did get exposed to Tantra, like Neo-Tantra in California. I also got exposed to the authentic relating and connection games in that time. And I went through a personal health crisis. So I suddenly discovered towards the end of that period that I had this very large grapefruit-sized tumor on my adrenal gland. And at first they thought it was perhaps this fatal kind of 2 years to live kind of cancer, because it's very rare to get an adrenal tumor that large. I sought some spiritual healing. I also was going to the surgeons in San Francisco and eventually had a surgery to take out the tumor. When they took it out, they were like, I don't know, we don't know. It doesn't seem like it's very malignant, so we hope you're gonna be okay. Like, take MRIs every 6 months, and so that's how it was for a couple of years with this kind of like mystery.
But it didn't come back?
Hasn't come back. Hopefully it won't come back. I feel like I've been doing a lot of this spiritual and psychological healing work that might have been linked to those themes.
Well, life is a mystery, and everything in it is a mystery. So even when we're going to die, we don't know. I mean, it could be literally now or in 50 years.
Meteor falls on us right now. Bye, guys.
Who knows? Who knows? Yeah. We have to go with the flow. We can trust only.
Yeah. So I had met a Polish woman during that time. Another Polish woman. And she was back in Poland, but she said, hey, why don't we go to Thailand? Why don't we go to Kohphangan? And this was after the surgery, several months later, and I was like, I have to change something, like something's not working here, I'm stuck. So I kind of said, okay, like this is a good invitation to change. So I put my stuff in storage, got rid of my house, little house, and basically flew to Poland to meet up with her dad and her, and then she and I came to Kohphangan.
Okay.
That was 5 years ago.
5 years ago.
Yeah. She essentially broke up with me like a day or two after we got here, which was, I'm smiling, I'm laughing at a bit. We're still friends now, but it was like a difficult, kind of painful transition. But it did free me to just be like, okay. And, I wound up exploring some of the Tantra and other things here. And after a certain period of time, I felt like, okay, it's enough for now. I felt called to Tamera, which is a really...
Tamera in Portugal.
Oh. Deep community project. They call themselves like a global healing eco-village. I felt like I got a lot there. And so the last few years have been a little more traveling around the world. I went back to the States briefly. I wound up in Guatemala for several months during the beginning of the pandemic. Wound up in England. And then now back to Kohphangan.
So, and now here you're holding space with the circling. That's your main thing at the moment, but also you have another class. Can you explain what is circling first?
Yeah, circling. Really, I feel that the central theme of authentic relating and these practices is like, can I have myself and have you too? So what does that mean? It's like, I have my own values, I have my own needs, I have my emotions, my feelings, my desires. Can I authentically be true to those and connected to those, and at the same time be in connection or relationship with you, who has your own set of values, your own needs, your own desires. Now, because of trauma, there are many ways we become sort of divided against ourselves. We learn this emotion's not acceptable. Like, I've seen that on the island a lot. Like, sadness, not okay. We have to be like positive, you know. Fear, not okay. Like, so we learn to kind of repress aspects of ourselves. Maybe we also learn, like I had an experience just a couple days ago, but this is a recurring thing for me, where sometimes it can be hard for me to tell someone like my physical boundaries, like they're touching me in a way I don't like, and I go into a freeze response. Now, why? Because like as a child, presumably like my boundaries were crossed many times. You know, you can imagine maybe someone picking up a small child who doesn't want to be picked up, and those, you know, cries or protests get ignored, and they're like, stop it, like, you know, like, so we can be very conditioned into like having our boundaries not respected, certain of our emotions not allowed. Maybe it's our joy, maybe it's our excitement, and so we start repressing all these. So then as we're together and something arises between us, maybe I'm like pushing down my authentic experience. Maybe I'm pushing away my sadness. Maybe I'm pushing away my enthusiasm to connect.
Yeah, it's very common and very normal in some ways. I mean, if you think of the Freudian superego, society expects you to behave in so many ways depending on your the culture you belong to or the place that you are. And in order to comply with these demands, these are sort of cultural, ethical, moral, legal, you know, family demands, you need to sort of tune down some of your desires, some of your sort of, you know, particular ways of relating to the world, because you want to put up a persona for the environment, right? And it's not just trauma related. I think it's everybody does it, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think it's important to have clarity about this, because this is why it's called developmental trauma. There's an important developmental process where we learn, okay, like if I get angry at you, it's not okay to punch you.
Yeah.
You know? But my anger is valid. And what happens with trauma, which is quite prevalent, I mean, really quite prevalent, is that I'm not even allowed to be angry. I'm not even allowed to be like, I don't want you to do that thing you're wanting to do to me, right? So there's both there is a healthy developmental process where we learn, yes, like sadness is valid, anger is valid. Here are like ways that we can express it and be in that are like can function as a
culturally allowed,
culturally and socially. But at the same time, there's so much, you know, of what like Teal Swan calls the emotional dark ages, where emotions are just rejected, suppressed, denied. Parts of ourselves, our needs, our values are suppressed, denied. So I wouldn't want to like, you know, say the superego is all that's good and right and just for society, right? There's a lot of unhealthy
manipulation,
manipulation and gaslighting and all
of
this
course.
stuff. Yeah. So then in this, really this applies to both the circling authentic relating and the parts work, but let's start with circling authentic relating. What we're doing is creating a practice container where we can actually be in an agreement and a willingness to allow more of what's actually happening to come to the surface. Because in everyday interactions, we can be very identified with those, like what you call the superego, or what in internal family systems they call protectors, managers, who are like trying to present an acceptable persona to the world. Oh, don't show my insecurity, don't show my sadness, don't show my need for connection right now, because, you know, bad things could happen. And really these bad things are like the bad things that happened to us and did happen when we were 3, 4, 7, 10, and those nervous system states still get very much activated and alive in us. It's called triggered, right? So how do we then work with those? So the circling authentic relating is one way to start creating space to actually be more in touch with like, how does my body feel right now? Oh, like I notice just talking about these things, there's a, you know, a bit of sadness here, there's a bit of maybe tension in my shoulder, and we kind of create a space where, you know, then you could reveal maybe what do you feel when I name those things, right?
Yes, for me there is a desire for food at the moment. Yeah, I'm a little hungry.
Right. Okay.
And also I got bitten by a mosquito,
Okay.
and I feel the mosquito here.
Right.
But other emotions, I feel very present and calm otherwise.
Yeah. And then I might say something like, ooh, when you started sharing at first about your hunger and your mosquito bite, I felt like a kind of protector come in of like, oh, I'm gonna pull away and close off because I was sharing a vulnerable emotion, and then my story was like, oh, he doesn't want to acknowledge that, he's going to some distraction, right? So I might say that, and then you might reveal like what that brings up in you.
Yeah,
right?
I'm sorry that you experienced that. I didn't mean to not be empathetic with your story.
Yeah.
Just I thought it was my turn to share my own things.
So you know, it creates the space for this kind of dialogue of like, what's actually happening here, right? What stories arise, what feelings arise, what, you know. And by coming together in the agreement to practice with that, we just have more space to do it than we would in ordinary life. So it becomes a sort of laboratory and self-inquiry process, relational inquiry process. And it can be quite potent. Like I've had a couple people, one I'm thinking of in particular, who's kind of stuck with me for 6 months since I've been doing the circling, and I've witnessed like in him a fairly profound transition in like how he relates to people and how he relates to the world. Like when he started at the beginning, he was constantly using humor, sarcasm as a defense to push people away or to kind of like keep a distance, and now he's like far more capable of like sharing what's alive for him, his own emotions, his vulnerability.
Great, that's great. It's very useful, first of all, to be able to feel your emotions and be authentic in expressing them to others that maybe you don't know very well either, not like your close friends, and then trying to make sense. And I've been part of a sharing circle for 1.5 years. Every Saturday we would meet with like a bunch of people, and I love that, you know, and just my ability to share is improved, the way I use words around it, you know, because sometimes people cannot express feelings very well.
Right.
And I think what you're doing is it's a sharing circle, but there is more to it, right? Because there is some techniques that you're using that you learned that are specific to circling.
Right.
Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So I think people sometimes hear circling and they're like, oh, well, that's just a sharing circle, or it's just a men's circle, women's circle. And there can be overlap for sure, and there's overlap with certain techniques like nonviolent communication. But one of the things we do in the practice is we focus on the relational container of the present moment. So that's a big difference, right? So whereas maybe in a sharing circle, people might just, you know, share some story that happened to them long ago, and they share it, and maybe a couple people say a couple things, and then you move on. We're really focused on, like, I would say that the idea is that everything that's happened to us is like a Buddhist notion of karma too, is present right here, right now, right? All of our traumas are present, all of our conditioning is present. So actually we can use the context of this circle to really investigate and explore, who am I? What is all this stuff? Have this story about you, or how you're responding to my emotion, or these kinds of things that are happening live. We all can be engaged with that. So that's like one frame, I think that's really important. And then yes, there are many kind of principles and techniques, ideas that inform circling and then come into it. You know, the idea of ownership, of like really using I language. I feel this, I sense this, I think this. I also, you know, ideas like sharing impact, like what arises in me after you say something. Tools like empathy, validation. Can I validate your reality?
Circling is one thing, and also you mentioned parts work.
Right.
So can you tell us what is the concept behind it and how you work with the parts?
Yeah. So parts work is basically the idea that there's a multiplicity within us of different sub-personalities, sub-personas, right? When this becomes very extreme, it's called like dissociative identity disorder. Like people like actually go fully into these different parts and, you know, have separate personalities with different names. But all of us have that going on a more subtle level where there's different aspects of us that are active in different moments. Many people may be familiar with the idea of like the inner critic. So if you hear a voice in your head that's like, you should have done this, you're failing at that, you need to be more. So that's a part, it's a voice, it's an aspect of our identity that has it. And one of the things that's interesting in the way I hold parts work and the way Internal Family Systems holds parts work is that we say that like there are no bad parts, like all of them are trying to fulfill a survival function.
Yeah.
So at some point that voice took on the role of, let's say there was a critical parent who was constantly criticizing or judging me, let's say, or you, when you're a child. And this part of yourself takes on that voice in order to avoid disconnection, punishment, abandonment, right? It's like if I can criticize myself and stop myself from doing the things that they don't like, then their love will still be available. Yeah. So these parts of us can internalize and take on various roles like that. And there are many roles, like the critic is just one. So there's, from IFS, they categorize the parts as having different roles. So the main roles are that you have your protectors and you have your exiles. Your exiles are the parts that are carrying really the intense burdens of our traumas often, right? So I was just in the last couple days, there's been a couple people I've been supporting who have some sexual abuse trauma, which I believe I do too. And so you can have the exiles carrying the extreme pain of that, there can be anger pieces, abandonment, like fear, and all of these intense emotions. So, and sometimes, one part's holding multiple emotions, but also there can be fragmentation where different parts are holding different emotions. And then think about a person who's gone through that experience and then needs to keep going in their life. And maybe it happened young when they're in a family, maybe it even happened in their family, right? And if that happens, it's like that child still needs to survive and function in that family even while this horrible thing is continuing to happen. And so they need to compartmentalize and push aspects of those experiences away because they're still dependent for survival on these adults. As a 12-year-old, you can't just, like most people, can't just leave the house and survive, or if they do, they're probably going to have a lot of trouble that way too, right? In a way, they get stuck in that time and space. They're not like updated. They're not like, oh, like we've grown up, that's not happy anymore. Because of the fragmentation, they're like still like holding those strategies and that reality very tightly. And so what happens as we're doing parts work is we first start to connect to those protectors and say like, wow, yes, I see like what an important job you've been doing. You had to do that job to like get us through. And we bring compassion and empathy and validation. And the idea is that in IFS and spiritually for me and probably many traditions, there's the idea that we have access to this like Buddha nature or transcendent self or the Christ consciousness, which is the aspect of self that is like love and acceptance and has space for all beingness, right? So it's also a spiritual perspective in a way. And we bring that quality of self into connection with these protectors and exiles. So it's really about how can I meet this part of me, which maybe can be very harsh, maybe can keep me disconnected from my body, maybe it can be quite judgmental, trying to keep me safe. how can I meet it with curiosity, compassion, see the role it's been playing, bring it understanding. And then the idea is what happens at that point is when you start to establish some connection or trust, just like maybe with a scared child, it starts to open up a little bit. And at a certain point it can say like, okay, like I'm willing to let you connect, let's say, to the exile, to the pain, which I have always felt like was unmanageable, right? The part thinks is unmanageable, but I'm seeing that there's a presence here now that has more capacity and space, has more compassion. First important thing to do is to work with the protectors. And so someone might have a dissociative part. I would, like in parts work and in the workshop that we do, we might actually take an object and be like, okay, let this represent the dissociative part, and like put it there. And now I can disidentify from it a bit and see like it's just a part. Now can I like engage in a dialogue with it? Okay. Right? Interesting. Yeah. And it's like, I see you, I see that you're using dissociation to keep us away. Yeah, tell me about it. Like, what's the role you're playing? Like, what is scary to you? Like, let me connect to you. Let me be here with you. And then, like at some point, this dissociation part is going to start to be like, huh, there's someone actually here. I've been alone, feeling like I need to do the job of like keeping it away and blank. But now I sense like an intelligence and presence and compassion here. That, okay, maybe let me show you a peek of the pain and the trauma, right? So it's like the protectors are the gateways to that. Now, for me, I also found that my protectors were really strong. I got very strong defenses of the flight type, of the dissociated type. And for me, like part of what's helped me kind of get closer to the exiles, and you know, just it's been part of the healing process working with psychedelics. So it can be useful ways of also like getting access to things that are very strongly buried. But I think like in IFS, they don't like as a program, they're not like we need psychedelics.
Sounds great. So, and now you've been here on and off for 5-6 years, yes?
I wasn't planning like actually to stay that long. It's been, excuse me, like 10 months or something now, 9-10 months. But it happened. I found that like I went through a whole nother wave of my own healing process as part of what kept me here. I started offering the circling, you know, many months ago, and so it's kind of been like, I feel like I'm in this open process, open-ended, of like, I'm doing my own healing work, I'm offering things, I'm still, yeah, like, what I love about kohphangan is it's, yeah, I like the international aspect of it. I like the consciousness aspect of it, although there's also unconsciousness. I felt a sense like of space and safety to go into my internal processes and do the work.
Well, Oren, well, thanks a lot for sharing your story. Very interesting, and yeah, I'm looking forward to coming to your circling, class as well very soon.
I would love to have you come. Yes. Thank you, Luca.